People say that menopause is having a day. Perhaps, but most women are still not on hormones even if they are in menopause. And there are many different ways to do hormone therapy. There is the static dosing, where you take the same amount of hormone every day. And there is something called rhythmic dosing, which is a system where you vary the amount of hormone you take every day, kind of like mimicking how your body produced estrogen and progesterone when you were having regular periods. This is understandably, or perhaps not so understandably, controversial. How much hormone, how much estrogen are you going to be taking every day? How much progesterone? So, today, I have the privilege of speaking to T.S. Wiley, who has created what's called the Wiley Protocol, and she is the author of this book called Sex, Lies, and Menopause. Here's our conversation. Welcome, T.S. Wiley.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Great. I had a conversation with Dr. Julie Taguchi, and of course, I've read your book, Sex, Lies, and Menopause, and I thought that was not only very witty, you have a lot of information packed in there. So,
I like to think so.
yes. So, I would love to start off by what was your life like before you got into this whole thing with hormones?
I grew up on a farm in Illinois, about 80 miles from the Iowa border, northern Illinois. And I think I was just looking at Lights Out, the other book I wrote. A lot of that knowledge of being on a farm went into Lights Out. And then I went to college in St. Louis, where I met my late husband. And I had 5 children. And we moved to Santa Barbara. That's how I know Dr. Taguchi. We lived on the East Coast and then on the West Coast, on the ocean. And having 5 children, and I had them at home, okay? It's not that I don't like doctors, it's that whenever I would say why or question something, I didn't feel the answer suffice. So I usually went to find my own answers. I had my first baby in a maternity center in New York City, in Manhattan, and then I had the rest at home. I had twins that died in utero, twin-to-twin transfusion. And I actually had a twin. There was 2 of me. And she died from twin-to-twin transfusion. So that makes me think, the progesterone phase can be inherited. I think it's interesting. At any rate, when my youngest was about 3, she's 31 now, and she has her own baby, Clementine. I had a friend I went to college with who became a literary agent. And she said, "Why don't you write all these things down?" And I said, "Well, because I only sign checks." And she said, "No, I can really write a book." So I went to Barnes and Noble and got a book about writing a book proposal. And I actually have written 3 books. The first one was about type 2 diabetes, and I replaced that with Lights Out. So I sat down and asked the question. Actually, I had a hot flash when my youngest was 3. We were in New York, and I was making him breakfast, and I was hot from the inside out. And I thought, I don't want to do this again. What is this? So thinking about it, I thought I probably need hormone replacement. Hormones go away at midlife. And I was maybe 42. I don't know. And the Women's Health Initiative was in full swing and said you would die if you took hormones. And I kind of thought if it were their hormones, you might die. There could be other kinds of hormones, or it could be done differently. So I guess the first question was, if estrogen kills women, all women would be dead. If estrogen kills women, all pregnant women would be deader. So it can't be the estrogen. It has to be when you take it and how you take it. And so that's what got me interested. And we went to see our oldest daughter at the University of Chicago, coming back home. And I stopped at the medical library and picked out some books. They arrived on our doorstep in Santa Barbara. They were textbooks. And I don't know, there was 7, 8 more. And I put them on one side of the desk, and I would open them and read them and mark them up and put them on the other side of the desk until I thought I understood the process of aging and ovulation in these endocrinology, molecular biology. I'm trying to think what else we did. And one day, a guy, no, it wasn't a guy, it was a friend of mine, said there's going to be a meeting at the hospital, Cottage Hospital in Santa Barbara, and it's for a new breast resource center. And I said to her, what's a breast resource center? I mean, if you're not buying bras, what are you doing? And she said, no, it's for cancer patients. And I said, I still don't understand. And she said, come to the meeting. And Susan Love, who was famous at that point, who was a surgeon, tried to write a book on hormones, and endocrinology is not surgery. But I went. And she was late, and she said it was menopause. She got lost, and I probably wasn't quiet enough. I said, you said your memory comes back after menopause. Yeah, well, mine hasn't come back yet. And I said, clearly. And I sat next to an old guy. His name was Bent Formby. He was a Danish molecular biologist. And as we were sitting there waiting, I said, what do you do? And he said, it's very complicated, my dear. And I said, well, you go slow. I'll catch up. And he said, well, I studied breast cancer. And I said, and insulin? And he said, oh, no. Estrogen. Okay, fine. And then I said, I got to go get my kids at school. So 2 weeks later, maybe he called me. I don't know where he got my number. Probably Julie. She gave you my number. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't know Julie yet. I answered the phone and he said, would you come to my office at Sansom Clinic and explain what you meant by insulin? I don't think he'd thought of it before. So I went to talk to Bent and explained to him what I thought happened in breast cancer. And he said, well, let's write that up. And I proposed it to a Canadian breast cancer conference. So I went to Ottawa, Canada to try to explain this idea about aging and breast cancer. And Susan Love was in the front row. It was exciting. And that's how I got started. Then I came back and decided to write about sleeping. That was Lights Out. And everything that'll kill you when you don't sleep. And Sex, Lies, and Menopause was the second book. And that was after I met Julie, because I wanted to talk to an oncologist and I wanted to understand what she was thinking when she would give them strange poison and think it would work. Because that's not what strange poison doesn't control your body. Hormones do. And they're seasonal and cyclical. That's how Julie and I got to know each other.
So, very unconventional, your whole entry into this world of hormones and breast cancer and the way to do hormones and rhythmic hormones and all that stuff. I have a question though. You mentioned that when you had your first hot flash, the WHI study was in full swing. Had they already come out by that time saying that estrogen is no good for you? Because my understanding is your book was published in 2003.
3.
Right. And the study came out in 2002.
Right, but you could read snippets from the study in the news, and it was clearly going toward this will kill you. Now, in the end, what killed the women were heart attacks and strokes from progestins. Estrogen had nothing to do with anything. So, wanting estrogen, I had to go find somebody who would make what I wanted, put it in the delivery system that I wanted. I found a guy in Bakersfield, compounding pharmacist, and we put it in 3 ml syringes because each line could be 1 milligram, or for progesterone 20 milligrams, and you'd get a discrete dose so you could run a study. At that point in time, to get compounded hormones, you got a tube and a spoon and a tub. There was nothing like medicine or science going on.
Hmm. Very interesting. And then tell me about the case which got you so interested about talking to Dr. Taguchi, an oncologist, about hormones and cancer.
Well, Ben's wife was a real estate agent, and I think it was her partner. I mean, it's 100 years ago now. I think it was her partner. Ben said he was in a swanky nursing home and he was dying of lung cancer, which turned out to be bladder cancer. And would I go see him? And I said, well, what do you want me to do, Ben? And he said, well, let's give him hormones. Ben was, in some ways, bigger risk taker than me. And I said, I don't think we can do that. He said, yeah, we have to do that. So I ran around my house and found jars and whatever, because at that point I was trying to convince Bent of the paper we inevitably published on BCL2 and apoptosis and progesterone. That's progesterone sculpts the fetus in utero, and progesterone comes out of the placenta. It's a progesterone producing tumor, the placenta. So Ben wanted me to give this man progesterone. And I said, well, I don't think it'll hurt him, but sure. So I went to meet him and I looked at his chart, which still, this is so long ago, it's still hanging on the foot of the bed. And I listened to him breathe and I said, this guy's got a fever. And Ben said, I don't know. And I said, yeah, he's got pneumonia. Look at this chart. So we called in a nurse who called in a doctor, got the poor guy some antibiotics. We gave him the progesterone and told him how to put it on. And Taguchi was his doctor. So I had to go to the hospital, find her, and ask her to take x-rays now that he had taken the progesterone for X amount of time.
Okay, so how long did he take progesterone and in what way did he take it? How was
It
this
was
administered?
compounded cream
Okay.
and a syringe he could draw it up in, because I'd have to have a prescription for him to get his own syringes. And he took it for 3 to 6 months.
Did
But he
he
was
inject
better.
it?
No,
Yeah.
cream.
Oh, the cream. So just topical cream.
Just rub it on. Yeah.
Okay.
If you've got a decent
Mhm.
carrier or base cream, it sinks through the skin, rests in the fat base, and every time your heart beats, those little capillaries pick some up. And the hallmark of an endocrine system is pulsatility, heartbeat, and amplitude. So how you dose it is the amplitude, right? 3 lines, 6 lines, 8 lines, whatever. So the guy was clearly better. He not only felt better, he looked better. And I went and found Julie and asked her to take another x-ray. And she said it was expensive. And I said, well, I'm sure he might pay for it, or his family. She took another x-ray. And the first one had bullet, from before, had like bullet holes in his lungs. The next one, they were gone. So she said, tell me how this happened. So I'm telling her how it happened, and Ben's making handcuff gestures like we're going to go to jail. So it was your idea, buddy. So Julie got interested. And I said, ideally, if we could have some cohort of your patients, we could see what it does in breast cancer. We could see what it does in uterine cancer. We could see. And I showed her the dosing schedule I had devised from the textbooks I read, the rhythm in a young woman. And I had certainly tested it. And I had a friend who was a midwife. She wanted to take it because we had to get the doses right. So that on day 12, we would provoke LH like a young woman. That's how you ovulate. And on day 12, we would make progesterone receptors for the second half of the cycle. In other words, the estrogen would go to the estrogen response element on a gene that produces a protein for the progesterone. And progesterone protein would float up, half in the cell, half out, and grab the progesterone and take it to the progesterone promoter region on the same gene. So, and Bent and I by then had written a paper. We got it published. And it was just on the idea of progesterone and the genes that had affected BCL2 backs. And it was really rudimentary. It didn't tell the story, but it was news to doctors. And then I kept going. There were women who wanted to take it in Santa Barbara. They went to their doctors, and there was a woman, Karen Abdullah, who set up meetings at some rich lady's house in Montecito. And all the women who took it had a sheet they had to fill out, symptoms they had and symptoms that went away. And then I would look at it and figure out what we needed to do to adjust it. But their doctor had to come to the meetings because I couldn't prescribe without a license. And 1, 2, 3, so at least 5, 6 doctors prescribing in town. And we got a lot of information from there.
So these women, they were suffering from breast cancer, or what was their complaint? What were we trying to
Some of
help
them
them?
had breast cancer. Some of them had blood cancers. Julie's specialty is hematology, besides breast cancer. Other ones just had complaints. Other ones had joints that hurt. Other ones didn't want to have a hot flash. Other ones thought it was a path to the fountain of youth. I mean, everybody was there for a reason, but they got the doctor to come, which I was interested in. So I could show the doctors what it could do. And I thought they would learn how to adjust it, right? So we now have something called a cheat sheet, which shows you it doesn't matter what the symptom is. It matters when the symptom is. So if you have a headache on day 12, it's different than a headache on day 6. So that's how I learned what the hormones were doing at what point in time in the cycle.
Okay, so I have another question, and I'm just trying to understand your understanding of the hormones and the rhythms and the cyclical nature from the first application with this gentleman who had lung cancer, and you
Well,
used.
it was really bladder cancer in the end. Yeah.
I see. So there was a Mets to the lungs.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So he had bladder cancer. You ended up using progesterone over a period of time. He got better. And then you went to kind of a projection into how these hormones used a certain way could be used to help women with various kinds of complaints.
Sure.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about that trajectory, like go for progesterone for that cancer?
Well, Julie was interested when she saw results.
Got it.
And as long as an oncologist showed up at these meetings,
Hmm.
Julie went, I think the women felt safer
Hmm.
because the news was still coming out that whatever. And I wrote Sex, Lies, and Menopause, and Julie's name and Bennett's name is on it because I'm just a housewife. At any rate, I think I had the book done by the time we started having the meetings. Some women read the book, some didn't. And it was the logical next step, I thought, to see in a bigger group of women what would happen with various complaints, some of them having had cancer or had cancer now. And I remember I went to see the endocrinologist at Sansom, a guy named, oh, come on. He was an endocrinologist, and we'd meet outside so he wouldn't get in trouble. And we were having lunch in the car, Alex Topali. And I said, Alex, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but some women don't get their period on day 28. There's like 5 of them. And he said, 5 out of 30. And I said, yeah, kind of. And he said, and you're worried about that? And I said, if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. I mean, we all start out as women. That bit about we're so unique and we're all different and whatever. Sure, but we're still basically women. Okay. So the lining is falling out sooner because if you had a uterus, that was the big glitch at the time. If you had a uterus, you had a period. And we had people who were 90 buying feminine hygiene products. And I had the Lois Capps was our local, I think, Democratic representative to Congress. And I went in to talk to her because I got invited to talk to the Senate. There was a Senate subcommittee hearing on compounded hormones because one of the senator's assistants had a mother who wanted hormones. So I got invited. And I went to talk to Lois Capps because she's in Congress. And she said, oh, you're that woman with the coven. I said, it's not a coven. It's just friendly meeting. We're just trying out hormones. So when I went to Washington, Lois was nice. She took me on the train between the two houses. And I had a friend who lived in DC. She worked for National Geographic. And she went with me, and I testified before the Senate that compounded hormones were valid. And in fact, found two articles that the US Army in Iraq for percussive head injuries gave the men progesterone instead of cortisol so their brains wouldn't swell. And another doctor named Dr. Wright in Georgia worked in an emergency room, and his wife had hormones made by the hospital pharmacy, compounded. And he thought to give them to 18-year-old men who crashed motorcycles and would otherwise die or have crippling and disabling brain damage. His study was very interesting. And I just said, you can't take them away from women if you're going to use them in the military. Doctors are using them. So then we went on to the next level, the government.
That's amazing. So have all these cases been written up? Is there documentation on all of these?
Oh, you can get my Senate testimony on the internet. You just
Okay.
put in my name and write Senate testimony.
And what year was this?
Oh, God. I knew you were going to ask that. I think it was 2006 or 7, but I could be wrong.
Mm.
I got a call from Suzanne Summers
Hmm.
because Santa Barbara is like the Hamptons to New York for LA. And Suzanne Summers was in a doctor's office in LA. And I knew that doctor's wife because they lived in Santa Barbara, really. And she said she wanted those hormones. So I introduced her to Taguchi because she had breast cancer at the time. And when the Senate called her, she said, I don't know anything about this. You have to have the person who invented it. And that's how I got there.
Interesting.
And I met Joanne Manson, who I still talk to. Joanne Manson is
I know who
at
she is.
Brigham and Women's Hospital. She was the cardiologist. Now I think she's head of something else. I talked to her at the beginning of the pandemic. We were going to do something on melatonin because she had done a study on vitamin D. And
Joanne Manson is one of the PIs of the WHI study.
yeah, she was
Okay.
there, right?
Hmm.
So she was at the testimony.
Hmm. And so, and she knows this whole thing with the hormones and all the cases that people have been helped with.
I don't know if she knows the details of the cases, but when I got home, she called Julie's office and said, do you want to be part of the next phase of the WHI?
Hmm.
Because I think it should be studied. And I said, well, I appreciate that, but how long is the next WHI? She said, 3 months. And I said, we can't do that. It takes 3 months to get all the receptors responding. So we wouldn't see the outcome in 3 months.
They were
And Julie,
planning.
huh?
I'm sorry that I didn't know that they were planning some sort of a follow-on to the WHI.
Yeah, they were doing a second half, and then they didn't. They were going to test Prozac for hot flashes. Remember? They talked about that in the news. They were going to do all kinds of dumb things.
Hmm.
And I met Rowan Chablowski. He was one of the principals. And I looked at him and said, why didn't you ever look at hot flashes? And he said, I don't know. It didn't occur to me. I said, whatever, Ron.
Hmm.
And I tried to get Ron to prescribe, but he would. And Joanne and I hadn't talked to her in 13 years since I said no, thank you. And Julie was heartbroken. She likes Joanne. She likes Harvard studies, big things. And I called her one night because I read a study she'd just done on vitamin D. And I thought it was sloppy. And I called the only number I found on the internet for her office. And I left a message and said, I'd like to talk to you about your study. I have some thoughts. You remember me, right? And she called me back at 6 o'clock in the morning the next morning, which was probably 8 o'clock in New York or Boston. And I told her what I was thinking, that she didn't gender and age match it, that it wasn't the amount of vitamin D they got. I mean, everybody gets vitamin D. If you walk from your car to the Quickie Mart, 10 minutes is enough. And everybody's low on it. Babies, adults, old people. Why is that? She said, I don't know. And I said, well, what makes a vitamin D receptor, Joanne? All right, might have called her Dr. Mans. Well, I suppose vitamin D. And I said, no, Hormones don't make their own receptors necessarily. I mean, they can, but melatonin makes a vitamin D receptor. So not sleeping, it doesn't matter how much vitamin D you take or get, you can't use it. I figured that out because I started teaching doctors in a planetarium in Glendale, California, because I could turn the lights out and take away their electronics and try to make them listen.
So I want to circle back to the book for a moment. You picked the title Sex, Lies, and Menopause. Tell me your thought behind that. Like, how did you end up settling on that title for the book?
Well, it's catchy. And there was a movie, Sex, Lies, and Videotape, that had come out some years before. And I thought Sex, Lies, and Menopause was appropriate for a book that takes you from being born a girl to breast cancer, what happens in the middle, and what they'll tell you happened. And that's not true. That's not
So,
how it happened.
okay, so then, you have this whole education about life on a farm, seeing the cyclical nature of everything, and then doing this, really, this study, not an official clinical study, but with this patient who had the bladder cancer, and then kind of going into helping women with various concerns. When you started helping or recommending that women take hormones in this rhythmic fashion, what was the response from the women in the first few months and years? And
Patients or the
yeah, with
doctor?
patients. Hmm.
Patients.
Yeah.
Patients felt better within about 6 months, maybe three. And they said they would never live without it. And there are women now who've been on it almost, certainly 25 years, almost 30, including me. And nobody died. I would demand Julie tell me if cancer patients come in on the hormones. And there was some lobular cancer in women over 60, but we're still not sure why, because it wasn't the hormones. Anyway, the women were delighted, felt good, liked being in some kind of club. I kept all the research. We had their doctors sign it. I signed it after a meeting that I said this, and this is what I think you should do. And I begged Julie for decades to just do a, N of one on the first guy. And she was in a hard position. She's an oncologist. And the problem with my worldview and hormones is it goes up to 8 milligrams minimum on day 12, morning and night. That's 16 milligrams of estrogen on that day. And then it drops to 4. And they kept saying it was so much estrogen. And then, of course, the Women's Health Initiative eventually had to admit it wasn't the estrogen, it was the progesterone. And then they said it's so much progesterone because on day 21, you take 14 lines of progesterone morning. So it was always fear of too much. And I tried to explain to them, you look at the receptors, it's not how much you take, it's how much you receive. And more importantly, too much is like none. You've heard of insulin resistance. Too much makes the receptor shut down. Does the same thing with steroid hormones. And you couldn't hurt somebody with too much. You could only proliferate if you gave them a chronic, low, steady dose, because that's how you have a period, day 1 to 5. The myometrium has stem cells that push off as it's making a new one because you're activating stem cells.
So, have there been any cases where somebody said, "Oh, I was taking rhythmic hormones and now I have breast cancer," or has somebody tried to
Yes.
do?
In
Okay.
fact, there's a phone number on the front of the package, 1-800
Uh-huh.
929 Wiley with no Y, too many letters.
Hmm.
And I invite people to call me, whether it's a doctor, a pharmacist, a person.
Hmm.
And I'll get a call once in a while from a woman who said, your hormones made me sick, or I got cancer and I was on your hormones. And I'd say, are you sure they're mine? And they said, I think so. And I said, where'd you get this phone number? And she said, on your website. And I said, what color are your packages? Because eventually it became obvious to me that I had to control the pharmacies in some way. Because compounding pharmacists will make anything they want, say anything they want, and charge anything they want because there's no regulation. And it may sound like I'm defending the FDA, and I guess I am, but there has to be regulation. So I got unique packaging. I trademarked my name. I got a patent on the dosing schedule. Nobody's ever patented dosing.
So, are you saying that if somebody's taking hormones in the manner that you've prescribed from a pharmacy that you know is complying with your suggestions, then you have not seen cases in that population?
Well, there's the lobular stuff that turned up, and those women had been on my hormones for, again, 20, 25 years. And they're sitting, they were 40 when I met them, and now they're in their 60s. And Julie's had a few, not a lot. I can't speak for Julie, but I think it's more like 5 or 10 out of 20,000 women. I also devised packaging so I could tell how many people were taking it, because I sell the packaging to the pharmacies empty. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a pharmacist. So I just sell empty packaging for licensing my intellectual property. And then I can tell who's on it. I can tell when they call if they took what I meant them to take.
Hmm.
One woman called and said, my doctor said to take a half dose because I'm so skinny and I don't feel good. And I said, I bet you don't. Who's your doctor? And it was a doctor who had come at least 3 times to the planetarium seminars. She knew better than that.
Hmm.
I was just dumbfounded.
So, okay, this raises a very interesting and important question. I've been using the book Estrogen Matters by Dr. Avram Blooming kind of like as my Bible. And in that, what he says is that if you're on hormone therapy, right, no doctor or oncologist will tell you that you will not get breast cancer. First of all, if you're on hormones, your chances of getting breast cancer are lesser than if you are not on hormones.
That's
And
right.
second, and second, if you do get breast cancer, your prognosis is much better.
That's right. And you realize they're talking about patches and pills and pellets. They're talking about all kinds of formulations, and you're never going to know. That's why it has to be regulated. In other words, it's like Valium. You can have a 5 or a 10. That's all you can get. And with the Wiley Protocol, you can get the basic dose, or you can raise it a line and make the curve higher, or 2 lines. And that's it. That's all you get to do. You don't get to cut the dose in half. You don't get to miss a day. I mean, some woman called me a while ago and said, I don't feel good on the progesterone. And I said, did you have children? And she said, no. I said, okay, so you've never encountered a placenta. You've never been full of progesterone. She said, no. And I said, how did you feel when you were young and had periods? And she said, well, they were so irregular. And I said, okay, you still have to take the progesterone because the estrogen sets up the milieu for the progesterone to keep you from having cancer. Cleans out your ducts, starts all over again, remyelinates nerves, rebuilds bone. It's osteoblastic. You have to take the progesterone. You will get used to it. I break it up. If you're taking 6 lines in the morning and 6 lines at night, that's 12. Take 3, 4 times for a couple of months till you get used to it. You'll sleep better. And it always works. They do fine.
So, it is my understanding from reading Dr. Blooming's books that he is mostly talking about the benefits of transdermal estrogen and mostly oral progesterone, is what my understanding is the bioidentical. So, although I do think I haven't found reference in his book with the rhythmic hormone dosing, I think it's mostly
No,
static
you
dosing,
won't.
whether it's patch or something, right?
Yeah.
So, are you suggesting that if more women were doing rhythmic dosing of hormones, that we might see an even reduced incidence of breast cancer?
Oh, I'd love to see that. And yes, I think so. Because sex lies in menopause, the whole point was you have to use them or lose them. And you can't breastfeed babies you never had. And infant population that decided not to have children, and reasonably so, they're at huge risk for their breasts becoming cancerous. That's obvious. There are numbers that women who breastfeed versus women who never had any children. So, yes, it's likely that if we put them back, yeah, when I was trying to decide the dose, I couldn't take enough to be pregnant, which is the safety zone. I could, I can't walk around lactating. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to go all the way back and make my body think I'm going to have a baby. I could have a baby. Ovulation might really be happening. So then I designed the dosing schedule so everybody'd have a period every month if they had a uterus. And that's almost like a monitor on a computer. You can tell when your monitor's broken, you don't throw the computer out the window, you fix it. So if you're not having a normal period, 4 or 5 days long, 6 maybe, and you have a heavy day 2 or 3, because the way the lining sheds, the fundus drops first, and 2 sides at once are heavier, day 2 and 3, and then 4 and 5 at the bottom. And then we start again. But I really think wouldn't see as much breast cancer. I think they create it with bad synthetics. I don't think it's the estrogen. They finally got it through their head that if you took estrogen by mouth, you'd end up with blood clots. It won't make it through the liver. So they'll do that in a cream or a pellet or whatever. But they still are giving people progesterone by mouth. And the minute it hits your liver, it makes GABA happen and people go to sleep. Well, that's nice, but it's not the point. The point is it doesn't have a real receptor because you didn't give them enough estrogen. So they're just receiving progesterone, GABA as a glucocorticoid. That's why some women take hormones and they get fat. First, it's edema. They retain water because progesterone in its own receptor, diuresis, in other words, get rid of that water. But progesterone in a glucocorticoid receptor makes sugar happen, it's like stress. And you can gain real weight after a while being on just progesterone with the wrong receptor.
Hmm. I have to say that, I really appreciate all this insight that you have into all the hormones and the intricacies of the dosing and the combination of the two together. I'm not sure a lot of doctors that are prescribing hormones today know the kind of detail that you are mentioning here. Is that right?
They're not very curious. The first seminar that I taught in Santa Barbara was at the Santa Barbara Planetarium, and it was really tiny. So we were outside for part of it, and they're all sitting outside. I got the compounding pharmacies to pay for the doctors to come. So they could stay for 2 days, and they get 17 CMEs, which is all you need in a year, and they would get lunch, and I could pay for a planetarium. So the first one, I'm looking at a guy who's like half asleep, and I'm looking at the rest of them, and I said, just tell me your hypothesis. Why you give hormones the way you do? And we went along, and they funked, and they made up stuff, and they said things that just blatant. It was like watching Trump give a speech, just blatantly weren't true, okay? And I said, my hypothesis is you don't have one. You're just doing what the standard of care says, and you're doing it with compounded stuff, so you think it's different. But that's not different. That's the standard of care, static doses, and nobody's going to
Okay.
get better than that.
So we've been talking about the intricacies, the technicalities of hormones in the last few minutes. I want to shift a little bit to the sociological, the cultural, the linguistic problems that I perceive with hormones. Like I have several friends that are MDs that are in their 50s not doing hormones because I just don't want to do it. I just want to be, natural. Like, why go there? And I'm like, oh my
Did you say,
gosh.
how did natural feel? Do
I'm
you
sorry, say that again.
ask them how natural feels?
Yeah.
And ask them if they sleep. And more importantly, explain to them that when they cease to be a man or a woman, because they have no hormones, they start to die. When you're not reproductive, Earth doesn't want you, okay? So you start to fall apart and die. And what is their logic in being natural? A cane? A walker? Chemotherapy? What do they really want out of being natural?
I think there is something particular about hormones that is scary. I was talking to this doctor only yesterday, and we were talking about, doctors will prescribe gabapentin for hot flashes. There are other drugs that are being used. So you think that is okay, but hormones are not? It's kind of like there is this just this irrational fear that is attached to hormones. And I think a big portion of that is just the fear keeps them from even studying, even approaching the hormones, doing their research. And I think that's the biggest problem is that it's just this diffuse, amorphous fear in the world about hormones, among other things.
Well, endocrinology is hard, complicated. And a lot of doctors who prescribe hormones are ER docs who can't stay up late anymore. They're tired. So they go to the Jumpstart Your Car with Crystals conferences, A4M and ACAM, and I don't know who else. Oh, functional medicine's a big deal at this point. And functional medicine is doing the standard of care with supplements, and you can't do that because when somebody's on the protocol and they want to take supplements, I'm trying to explain to them if a supplement works, it's hitting a steroid receptor if it's doing you any good. And you're putting a line right through my rhythm when you take them the same every day. So you can't just chuck down the same dose every day. You'd have to have a rhythm for those hormones. Probably what would be to eat in nature, probably day or night, melatonin. It's just, they don't understand the planet's spinning. And if you're not spinning with it, you fall off. It's one of those things.
Okay, so I have this question, even though this wasn't the main topic that we've been talking about, but I would love to hear a little about melatonin from you. Like, what, so many women have trouble sleeping through the night, and they'll try many different kinds of sleeping aids, but they're also afraid of melatonin for some reason. I don't understand. Can
What
you?
they're taking is antihistamines, and that puts you to sleep, Benadryl or any other
Right.
antihistamine. Melatonin, when I called Joanne and said melatonin makes a vitamin D receptor. So you're never going to see no matter, she was looking at cardiac stuff because she's a cardiologist. And you're never going to see a result, no matter how much, 10,000 units of vitamin D, because it has no receptor, because nobody sleeps. Babies don't sleep, people don't sleep, old people don't sleep. And when she wanted to write, I said, "Do you have any blood left?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, because it was a 16,000 person study, you have to assume a drug company paid for it. They tried to make a vitamin A prescription once, and they were trying to make vitamin D a prescription, I think. And she said, "Yeah, I have blood left over." And I said, "When did you draw it?" And she said, "About 3 months ago." And I said, "No, Joanne, morning or night?" Not long ago. And she said, "In the morning." And I said, "Okay, because if these people didn't have melatonin at night, it comes back in the morning. You've stayed up too late and you feel like you're drugged. You can't get out of bed. You're too tired. That's melatonin returning
Mhm.
in the morning." And I said, if we could prove that and then use the receptor research on D and melatonin, that's not a bad paper. And she was very excited. And we were going to work on it, but the pandemic hit like the next day. And they called her to duty at Harvard. One of my grandsons goes to Harvard. I will tell you the research I did, because we were going to write a paper. I was stunned. When I looked at estrogen, they found estrogen receptors in jawless fish before the Pleistocene, but they didn't think there was estrogen. So that's a chicken or an egg, a receptor or a hormone. I don't know. And I thought that was really interesting. But it turns out melatonin is in everything. There isn't anything growing in your garden. There isn't any animal. There isn't any insect. There isn't anything that doesn't have melatonin and melatonin receptors. So it's even older. It's fascinating. And melatonin, if you don't take melatonin before bed, if you don't have a surge, it gets dark, your melatonin peaks, and it blocks estrogen. So your estrogen will pop back up in the middle of the night and keep you asleep. You know how women wake up at 1 and 3 and 2 and 4? That's because they didn't have that snapback of estrogen because they didn't have any melatonin.
Mm.
Melatonin's not going to hurt you. But again, they tried 30 milligrams, stuff like that for cancer, and that's way too much. It's not necessary. I made melatonin just like the estrogen and progesterone. And it's in a black package with moons and stars. I was pretty bored by then. And how much you take in what season. And it's a cream, and it works really well.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. So I want to switch into some just practical advice for women that you might want to share with us. But I also want to ask, are you planning on a sequel to Sex, Lies, and Menopause, or is there another book coming out?
I said what I had to say 23 years ago or something. No, it's 2005, 22 years ago. And I think I got it right. And I'm satisfied. I mean, more women are not having children, and more women who have children aren't breastfeeding. They need to work. The publisher, which is HarperCollins, talked about re releasing it. I don't know if we'll ever get that. But right now, with climate change, the earth is cracking in half. The iron ball in the middle of the earth is deforming into a different shape. I don't know what's going to happen to people. I still know if you don't reproduce, if you don't breastfeed, you're at risk for osteoporosis, you're more risk for MS, autoimmune diseases. Those articles I sent you, I didn't expect you to read them before we talked, but I thought you would find them interesting because one of them says menopause is having its moment again.
Mhm.
And it's about Naomi Watts. And you talk about doctors being scared. I know her best friend, Naomi's best friend. She was my roommate in college. And I said, do you want to tell her about this? And she said, well, I wouldn't want to presume. I wouldn't want to. And I said, you wouldn't want to save her life. She wants hormones. And her mother had died of breast cancer, my roommate. And she had 8 children, but she didn't breastfeed any of them. Not 8, I'm sorry, 6, I think. But she didn't breastfeed any of them. And I tried to explain that to my friend. And it turned out in this article that I sent you, they were complaining that Naomi Watts just sells products. Have some lotion for your dry skin, have some whatever. And hormones are too hot a topic in Australia, I guess,
Yeah.
just like they are here. And I don't know why. You have to understand them, but understanding them is no different than understanding the weather, right?
Yes, I am continuously amazed that people are as afraid of hormones as they are. But there's other arguments also against hormones. Like some women think that it's anti-feminist somehow to take hormones, or that
Oh,
we, I
that's
mean,
the old, what's her name, Greer. She wrote a book, and so did, there were two 40-year-old feminists back in the 70s or 80s, 70s, I think, who wrote books saying that your vision is cleared. And when you become a crone, no hormones and old, you have more power and all that's true if you don't drop dead first. Or if you've got enough energy to get out of bed, or you're not missing your chemotherapy appointment.
and also, there are women who are like, you are medicalizing menopause. Like that's again all the natural thing. It's like, but what in our world is natural today? Our clothes are natural. Everything has chemicals in it.
High
Uh,
stuff is the health food of hormones. Okay? It's estrogen and progesterone in powders that go to a pharmacy who has had to sign a contract with me. They dissolve it in glycerin because that won't hurt you for 30 years. Most pharmacies dissolve compounded hormones in propylene glycol, which is antifreeze. You don't want to put that on for 30 years. And I made up a cream. You could eat it. It's only got about 3 ingredients. There's nothing to hurt you in there. And
Yeah,
if
I
you,
think it's just like women being willing to educate themselves. Despite the fear, even if you're afraid, it's important to educate yourself. Otherwise, you're not going to know. And what you don't know, then you might end up being hurt by what you don't know because you're not taking advantage of something that can help you for so many things. Right. So,
well, not everybody finds science as riveting as I do. So I get that. But you can ask your doctor for an osteoporosis scan. You can ask your doctor I wouldn't get a mammogram ever. I wrote about that. You could get a thermogram or a sonogram. I would ask your doctor if there's any testing, if you have anybody in your family with MS or lupus or whatever. And then I would take hormones, preferably mine, for 6 months. Go get those tests again. Because we showed frank osteoporosis was gone in 6 months, 6 months osteopenia, and 18 months osteoporosis. One of our doctors, Dr. Courtney Ridley, did that study. And people were all worried 20 years ago about the metabolites of estrogen, uh, the 1, 2, and 3. And one of the doctors in Santa Barbara did that study and showed that with the protocol, they were fine. They were the way they were supposed to be. Not too much of the bad one. So do your own study on your own body if you can't do anything else. If you don't want to read about it, if you don't really want to understand it, I just think it's logical. Young women don't have osteoporosis. Young women don't, get breast cancer that often. Young women don't. I mean, they're getting colon cancer now, which is fascinating. Julie and I were talking about that the other day. And that's probably bad processed food, but I don't know. Anyway, you lose your hormones at midlife and you get cancer and arthritis and more autoimmune diseases. You can't sleep. You lose your libido. Most people look like hell. So, I mean, it's logical that when your hormones go away, you're not okay. And you need them.
Interestingly, there is this thing about I mean, most women have symptoms. There is some discomfort. Even if you don't have hot flashes, there's something going on. And then there is this small percentage of women who don't have symptoms. So, would that be more estrone than estradiol?
No.
That would okay.
What was interesting, I mean, I was always interested in estrone, estriol, estradiol. I wanted to know what estradiol and estrone can trade places if you look at those charts. One can convert to the other, no matter what. And estriol is a spent metabolite. And the only thing estriol does is make more estrogen receptor alpha for estradiol. That's interesting. So the women who feel better because they got a little estriol got a few more receptors for any estrogen, estradiol they could make out of testosterone. But I think I really understood it when I got a call, and it was before the pandemic, so it was 5 years ago maybe. I took Julie with me. A guy wanted me to speak at their conference in San Diego. And I said, well, thank you, but what's the conference about? And he said, the human biome. And I said, no, I can't do that. That's not what I do. I mean, you guys talk about kale and poop, and no, thank you. And he said, well, just think about it. So I hung up and I thought I was pretty rude. So I called him back and I said, you know what I write about? And he said, yeah, write about it, or tell us about it for the bio. And I thought, oh, that's pretty complicated. There's only how many trillion bacteria in there? I said, let me try. And he said, well, you got to get your proposal in, whatever you can talk about, in 2 weeks. Well, that didn't happen because it took me a while because I was studying. I took a Khan Academy course on microbiology because I called a friend who owns a DNA company. And I said to him, all the trillions of bacteria don't have double helixes, do they? How do they receive genetic information from hormones, all kinds of hormones? And he said, how would I know? And I said, okay, fine. I said, I'll call you when I figure it out. So I took that course, and it turns out they have a crescent moon shaped genome. But they do have estrogen response elements and progesterone promoter regions and whatever. And I finally figured out, lucky for me, that if the hormones are not presented in the gut in the right timing and the right amount, they don't even recognize it as hormones. They think it's food, they think it's something else, they don't know. So I went to the conference, Julie went with me, and I explained to the doctors they were just meat sacks, and the hormones, or the bacteria control them. The bacteria controls the planet. So here's how hormones control bacteria. And then I thought, yeah, it really does have to be seasonal and in a rhythm.
Well, so this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much. Would you have one parting word for us, for doctors, for women, for health going forward, taking ownership, not being afraid? What's your final advice to us, at least on this episode?
We're all in this alone. And you have to take care of yourself. And if you don't want to do the kind of work I did for 20 years, I remember when I wrote Sex, Lies, and Menopause, I was on the 6th edit. And I said to my friend, the agent, this wasn't supposed to be my life's work. And she said, how do you know? So if you don't want to do that, at least in your own case, be brave enough to do what's logical. It is not logical that you have the same hormones every day for, in those hospital shows when people flatline and the camera closes up on it, that means you're dead. So unless you can dance with the planet and the weather and the what, you're dead already. And you should figure that out. Go get some hormones, try them if you don't feel good. As I said, if you get my hormones, you can call me. It rings at my house because I want to know what's going on.
Okay.
I
Thank you
love
so
I
uh,
love to answer the phone. They go, "Wait, you're really T.S. Wiley?" And I go, "Yeah."
well, thank you, T.S. Wiley. This has been very, very wonderful talking to you and very informational, educational. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you.
You're welcome. And if you ever want to talk about sleep, you talk about Lights Out because I think
Okay.
it's a better book. Yeah.
We will do that. We will do that. We will plan to do that. Thank you.